when we get majority governments, they're getting in with 39% of the vote. That's not really a majority, and it means that they're able to govern in the interests of a minority of the Canadians.
Hello, OneSunnyDay.com podcast. Today my guest is Nick Page. He is running for the Burlington federal seat in the upcoming election for the Ndp. Hello, Nick, and welcome to the program.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. I'm glad you could be here. I normally start off by asking what drew you to run in this race?
I think that Canadians need better leadership. We need to move forward in the future. We're going to need to get universal basic income going. And to deal with the environment, I believe we're going to need a better electoral system. So I'm getting involved to try to push the message behind those two in particular, try to get that message out to see if we can change the way Canadians think about those policies.
So what's wrong with the current electoral system in your mind?
The big problem with the current electoral system is that when we get majority governments, they're getting in with 39% of the vote. That's not really a majority, and it means that they're able to govern in the interests of a minority of the Canadians, which is how we're getting big corporate tax cuts pushed through, even though they don't help regular Canadians, and it's how we're ending up buying pipelines instead of dealing with the environment. In a more proportional system, we will end up electing more people that more reflect the interests of regular Canadians. The Green Party will get more seats. The NDP will get more seats. And people will be able to vote for what they actually believe in, which I believe will mean that we'll be able to deal with the environmental crisis in a better way in the future.
So you don't like the first past the post system, right?
Correct.
That's basically and then you would go to what?
My idea would be proportional representation. So you'd still have ridings, and you'd still elect local candidates. But on top of that, the parties would be able to present a list of people, and then if you don't get the right number of seats for your vote across the country, you would be topped up in seats, which would mean that if a given party got, say, 10% of the vote in every riding, right now they get 0 seats. But in a proportional system, they would get 10% of the seats in government, which would allow their voice to be heard in government. We would have far fewer majorities, and politicians would be forced to work together, which I think is important, especially as we're becoming more and more divisive between left and right. I think it's more important that we have a system that makes people work together to reflect the interests of everyone, not just whoever happens to get in.
So the wrinkle we have, of course, is like, is that when the minority government, you can get like this non-confidence vote, and this sort of can trigger an infinite sort of set of elections under the current system, right? So, but you're not concerned about that element of having more minority versus majority governments.
The big thing with the votes of non-confidence is governments trigger those when they think they can still win a majority afterwards. In a more proportional system, if you're not expecting to be able to win a majority, you don't have things like Trudeau calling this election. He's just actually forced to work with someone else. And right now, it's not that no one was working with him. He was still getting stuff passed, just not as easily as he would like. And I think it's a problem that he doesn't want to work with other people. I think it's important for government to be able to work together. And our current system right now kind of encourages politicians to not work together. And I think that's a problem. And I think under a more proportional system where you understand that you're always in, or not always, but mostly in minority governments, I think politicians will adapt, and we won't see election after election after election being called, because they'll just start working together.
Right. Well, you see lots of Europe can only really form these coalition governments. Right. And in all fairness, the place doesn't like completely fall apart and start, burning. Right.
It does work.
And then your second point was the UBI, Universal Basic Income.
For universal basic income, I think it's important right now. We've seen that through the pandemic, that being able to give people, like, CERB didn't do enough. I don't believe CERB didn't do enough, but it was a start, and it showed what a basic income can help do. It can help people get through the, like, small blips. It can help people deal with economic uncertainty. People are able to be less stressed out if they know for sure that when their job goes away, they'll still be able to feed their family. And I think that's going to be even more important in the next 10, 20, 30 years as we start seeing more and more automation come in. Self-driving cars are really close to being a reality. And once that happens, we're going to see, like, all shipping is going to be done automated. They're not going to pay for drivers anymore. And that's going to be a big, big hit to working class people when we no longer have taxis, we no longer have Uber, we no longer have like truckers. When that's all replaced by robots, those people need to know that they're going to be able to feed themselves, that they're going to be able to have a house, they're going to be able to be retrained, that they're going to have the resources available so that they can switch to doing something else. Because people like to be productive. That's just an innate human quality. We want to work. We want to be productive. But we don't really want to do busy work, and we don't want to do, and we won't be able to do things that are easily automated because it's going to be very profitable to cut people out. So I think it's important that we set up the framework now so that the regular people don't get hurt by automation, so that we can all celebrate automation, because it's actually a very good thing that people aren't going to be forced to do, like, driving stuff across the country. There's no real reason for that to be a human thing. It's just right now we're in the mindset that people have to work for a living to deserve to live, and I don't think that's a good thing. So I want to get the message out that a universal basic income will just help everybody.
So okay, then the two pivots are is there means testing? There's like two pivots to this question always. Does everybody get it, or is it sort of a means tested program in your mind ideally?
In my view, it is entirely everyone gets it. The means testing it's both not needed and it's kind of dehumanizing. I've gone through it recently trying to get on Ontario Disability, and it's just forcing people to jump through a lot of hoops and answer a lot of questions that honestly shouldn't need to be asked or answered. Sometimes people bring up an issue that, oh, you're going to give all the rich people extra money too, but those people are in higher tax brackets anyway. Most of that's going to get taxed back if they're at the point where they shouldn't get it. And by not means testing at all, you're just saying everyone deserves this. And if they're ultra rich, they're going to get almost all of it clawed back anyway. But I think it's important to put that burden on the people who are making more money to pay it back in taxes than it is to put the burden on people who are at the rough point in their life and forcing them to jump through the hoops.
Yeah, like if you're going to do it, I also think the means testing is a problem, because if you make it sort of a general thing, right, it also prevents you from creating some massive bureaucracy to try and figure out the means testing. It also prevents political games from going on in the means testing, right? Like I can run on a campaign and say, oh, I'm going to, increase the bracket up or down by some amount. Like you just imagine constant, oh, well, the inflation cost of living is up 10. Do you want to make this more 10? Like a lot of political games will execute out of who's testing and whatever. So I think if you imagine it, I do think doing it globally is the way to do, just to prevent saying of another bureaucracy. And then the second point, there's kind of two theories. So the first theory is the wipeout theory, where you put in the universal basic income, and to pay for some of it, you mop up all these existing programs, right? This is one idea out there. And so you blow away all the existing fields of programs that are means tested and try and do these things. And you say, well, hold on, we have a much slicker process. We can just go cut a check every month. then we don't have to look into what these people are doing. We don't have to figure out if they're, if they're still in the disabled category, or we don't have to understand the rent subsidies. We can just ignore all that. We can cut checks. The bureaucracies to implement those things disappear, and everybody just gets a straight check, and we don't have to worry about it. So do you think the existing programs exist, or do you blow them away sort of in favor of this?
I think most of them probably go away. I think you need to look at what the world looks like after this comes in, but for the most part, I think blowing it away, in your words, is probably the way to go, especially because a lot of the bureaucracy around these things is partly to just make sure people have jobs right now. These are the sorts of jobs that don't even need to exist. They're just people doing things for the sake of doing things. So I think it's better if all the people in this bureaucracy don't exist as bureaucrats, if they get the universal basic income and then they go and retrain and do something more productive, something more useful, or just something more interesting. We can get more artists, we can get more like theater, we get more TV shows, we get more useful things that people can enjoy out of it instead of just people doing things to do things, right?
Most of the bureaucracy, just to be fair to them, is about bad actors, right? It's that there's a sensitivity to the idea that there's this bad actor that's getting this thing that shouldn't, right?
Oh, yes.
And then the whole bureaucracy is screening through 90% of people who are, or 99 probably, who are legitimately in need of this program, right? And then there's like this 1% bad actor, but because there's the 1% bad actor, you have to check through 100 cases, right? And then you just to find this one person who's not doing it. And then as you get more complexity of the system, right? Somebody says, well, we meant it to apply to this person, but not this person. And so the rules get changed, and then this person and not this person, the rules get changed. The grid of if you get it or not gets more and more complicated, right? Yes. And then so we need more people to figure out those rules. Should we change the rules? So the bureaucracy blows up. So, and then if you're blowing things away, the next question is a lot easier, because the next question is, how do you intend to pay for this thing, right? But if you're blowing the existing programs away, you get a lot of savings, in all fairness, to move it. So how much do you think it should be per person, thereabouts?
That's a tricky one. I think it should be enough to be able to have a shelter, like have affordable housing, and to be able to feed yourself comfortably. What that's going to look like in a world where we're doing this, it revolves a lot around, can we get affordable housing in place? Like there's all these other parts. It's not as simple as just, all right, we bring in universal basic income. It should be $2,000 a month, or it should be $3,000 a month.
But I don't think that doing it minorly works at all, right? Like if you say, hey, we're setting up for $500, then, well, all the different things still need to exist, right? The problem is
$500 certainly.
And I said this on another podcast. Yeah. I said this on another podcast. The problem is you're creating a jump ball, right? So it could work out beautifully, right? Because the other thing that could happen is you could have all these people who are in a job which is not optimal for them. They can't figure out how to switch. But if you give them $2,000, they'll decide, that they don't want to be lawyers, but they do want to be property developers. And they'll do that by themselves now that they have a buffer, right? So you could have an explosion of productivity, or it could be a massive society-ending disaster. But it's very hard to predict what it is, because you can't, because all the dynamics are going to change, right? And I do think it's a very interesting idea. I think it works actually better with a lower population. Like I don't think that increasing your population is helping you to do the universal basic income, right? Because you have to switch to this. This is a massive switch. You don't know how people are going to react. You can't tell how much properties are really going to cost anymore, right? Because everything's going to shuffle weirdly. And the real problem that you hit upon is people say affordable housing, but if you look, there is affordable housing. It's just not affordable housing in the cities where in the location where people want to live, right? So it makes this really indelicate question. Is how much you tolerate people building these cities and building these areas where people want to live in the area, but they're getting squished out by pricing. You see what I mean?
Part of that is also, I think, gets fixed in that right now people are so drawn to these huge cities because that's where the opportunities are. And they feel the need to go to those opportunities because they have no other way of making a living, so to speak. Like, right now, we see people, like, commuting from Burlington or Hamilton or whatnot into Toronto to work because Toronto's so expensive. But if you don't need to work in Toronto, you can afford to live out in Grimsby and like work from home or do what you need to do in Grimsby instead of having to have the job in Toronto. If that makes sense. Like, I think affordable housing becomes less of an issue the less we force people into the big cities.
Oh, I think what you could get, and I mean, this is just purebred speculation, right? But what happens if you do your UBI thing, it's working, and you start seeing this like sorting, right? Where the people that are on the UBI, there'll be like a place that's optimal for them, right? So they keep clustering in this place that's optimal for them, and then other people are still making much more money, and they say, oh, well, this is the place that's optimal for me, right? Because if you're planning to do digital art, right, let's say, and you've got this universal basic income, what do you care about being near the city at all? You just, you can go anywhere, right? You can just go to the far-flung country as long as you have an internet and, people around you that, you enjoy, right? But there's another person who's going to be like, really attached to this, now $200,000 a year job, right? Which you're getting taxed at some, big section for, right? And they're going to be like more into the city. So
I don't know that you'd be taxing the people who are making only 200,000 a year at that much different than you are now. I think a lot of the way you'd be paying for this is through taxing the people, like not the people, but the corporations that are getting such a benefit out of the automation in the first place. The companies that are profiting so much from people losing their jobs.
Yeah, I think it's, listen, who knows? I mean, we're just in blue sky speculation, right? The issue is that there's a very small band. Like, people always say, well, tax rich people, tax the corporations, right? But the problem is these people react to tax it. What's weird about it is once you make more money, right? Once these people have more money, they have way more freedom that somebody who has less money, and they could use that money to optimize their way out of whatever you do. So, for example, if you've got somebody who makes $50,000 a year, and you say, "Oh, I'm increasing your taxes by 2%, 3%, 5% a year," what are they going to do? Nothing, right? They're just going to pay the money and whatever. But if you get somebody that makes $10 million a year, and you say, "I'm going to increase my taxes for 5%," they can go, "Well, the heck with this! I'm going to this island. I'm going to live on my live in my super yacht. I'm going to restructure my company to operate out of someplace else," right? So I think it becomes really, really difficult to imagine that you have that much room to maneuver before these people just go to wherever the next better deal is and say, I mean, a lot of these people are almost global citizens anyway, really, right? And so I think that the reality of it is, because I've done crunched numbers a couple times, right? And I think what you have to do, if you're really thinking you're going to do it and you're going to base everybody at 24,000, right? I think you do have to have in your mind, there's this like immediately like hard slope. I did the numbers a couple times. It's something like 25. It depends if you shuffle things in, right? But it's something like 24,000, and then almost like the next dollar is taxed at 50%. So there's like an immediate slope as you get out of it. Then you can make the money work, right? Okay. But although you're thinking, hey, I got my first dollar taxed at 50%. No, but you got the first 24 grand free, right? So, like to get to, like, you see what I'm saying, right? To get now back to even like a 25% tax rate, that you have to be making 50 grand if I tax every dollar past the 24 grand at 50%. My point is, you can make the formula work.
Yeah.
But I think it is true that the mid-range of people are going to be sort of paying more under this, and you can't just lay it off on some imaginary rich people.
I do think that like the 200,000 will be paying more than now. I don't know that it would be that much more, but I think that it would work. Like it would work out in the long run.
But they're going to seem to. is my point, right? Because right
Yeah.
now they're getting 200 grand, right? Let's say it's a couple and their combined income is 200 grand. So the they're really scraping 120,000 bucks out of this hypothetical family is running the family if they both make if the 200 if they each make 100, let's say, which lots of people do, like teachers, cops. That's
Yeah, that's not
and
an unreasonable
they're a
number at all.
couple. Yeah, they're making 200 grand. The government's taking 80, right? Their take home income is 120,000. You think they should be balling, okay, but they're not, because the mortgage is $1 million and the daycare and all these things is like chipping away at them, right? So it's not like, I don't want to say these people are suffering, right? But when you change the formula, well, now they're getting 50 for free, right? So now they're getting 50 for free. You only have $150,000 left to tax, right? So you almost have to tax that next $150,000 at 50%, so that if my point is, if you did that, those people would be in the same place they were before. Am I making sense or babbling?
Yeah, yeah. Well, they'd be up to 250,000 though if we're giving them their first 50 for free, and you would have to. Right. So to get to their 120 now, they'd still be able to be taxed that extra 50K on the 200K to still end up at the same point, and we'd still be benefiting the other people.
But it all has to balance out at the end of the day, right? Like whatever monetary tricks you pick, the real thing that you're on against is that there's only so much productivity in the world, right? Like we use money to keep track of it all in this like complicated mess, right? But you only have so many people doing so many things, right? There's only so many houses being built. There's only so many whatever, right? So whatever you do with the money, it affects how much people are willing to work and how much people are willing to do with other things. But you can't really magically change the productive nature of the average person, right? You can just free them. So you can free them, and then maybe in that freedom they get an optimization. Yeah. But then there's a lot of people who are doing crappy jobs they don't want to do, right? You're going to free them. They're going to say, I'm not working at McDonald's anymore. People are going to still want McDonald's burgers. You're going to have to pay people what to work at McDonald's, a really significant amount, like 50,000. You're going to have to really incentivize them to come in and work at McDonald's, right? Because you're going to have this base. So listen, I'm not a master in human psychology. It's going to go all over the place. But to me, where it's like really maybe super works, and people are like, I don't know why we didn't do this like 50 years ago, is if there really is creepy optimization after creepy optimization after creepy optimization, and all these people go, well, we can structure our lives so we can get by, our family can get by with 50K. Push comes to shove, we're not going to starve, we're not going to be on the street, and therefore, you know what, honey, you can quit your job and work on your illustrated books of docks across Canada, or whatever it is that wouldn't have happened before if we didn't have this thing. So I think it's very interesting. The automation is an interesting piece, and you're quite right. The automation can get to a place where it's almost enforced. Okay, well that's the UBI part, and then the Ndp platform. So I had the platform here. I'll let you go through the platform points. So the first one was affordability. Was the first Ndp, the sort of summary point that they had. They had, people are getting squeezed as everything from housing to medication gets more expensive. We'll put a stop to skyrocketing prices to make sure young people can build a good life.
Like part of that piece is going to be the pharmacare. Like the skyrocketing prices of prescription drugs is a problem. Like if you need insulin, if you need SSRIs, whatever it may be, paying for those drugs out of pocket is rough for a lot of people, and it is also putting a burden on companies to pay for the insurance for their employees. Shifting that all into government and letting government deal with buying these things in bulk has to be better, like just in the long run, I believe, for making things more affordable for the average Canadian.
Well, you got two issues there, right? So the issue is that you're also now getting a brand of drugs which is insanely more expensive than any drugs we've ever seen, right? So when the original systems were set up, it's like, okay, what are the drugs are all relatively cheap in the grand scheme of things. You now have these designer treatments that are coming in that are targeting rare conditions, but require a lot of work and could cost, 10, 20, 1,000, per person. And the government has a harder time, I think, dealing with that.
Sure, but those people do deserve to be treated.
I think that some of the treatments now, like there's the Parkinson's one and are coming in, are so expensive that you can't imagine everyone can be treated because of just the number of people and the amount of money. These drugs, these like keyhole drugs, and I don't mean to seem incredibly insensitive if you're one of the 10 or 20 people who's the target of this drug. It's like a life-changing medication that somebody's developed, right? But the back end cost of them is getting crazier and crazier. And then as the money comes available to pay for these things, right, the companies invent ever crazier, more expensive drugs that target ever smaller conditions because they know the money exists to pay for those drugs. So I think we're on a bit of a weird feed forward cycle where the drug care is getting more and more and more expensive. So you would like all of the drugs paid for, sort of no matter what, without establishing kind of a cutoff of what makes sense, right? Because you could say, hey,
Yes.
we're doing pharmacare only up to 20 grand, and then if it hits to 20 grand, you're going to have private insurance or figure out how to pay for your medication some other way, right? You could have a cap, which would be the way to kind of deal with some of it.
I would rather not see that. I would imagine that to get pharmacare through, a cap would probably need to go through. Like pie in the sky, I wouldn't want there to be a cap, but I could see that in order to like I was saying earlier about how I want to see government working more together, I can see how maybe an NDP and Liberal coalition end up with a cap that you're talking about. I do think that the price of these drugs will come down as we show that we're more willing to pay for them, like you're saying. They're going to develop more and more drugs, but there's also going to be people working to make them more affordable also.
I think if you went condition to condition, you discover it is getting cheaper, right? So like if you have a condition and you were paying for your drug 10 or 40 to 30 years ago, that drug is now cheaper because it's become generic or they've come up with these biosimilar things. But the trouble I don't want to say this is a trouble because this is like a nice problem to have, is that the companies are now, it's like the companies don't stand up and say, we need some cure for the headache, because they're like, no, that's handled at 10 cents per headache, and we don't need to deal with that.
Yeah.
So when they wake up and they're creating new drugs, they're targeting into really ever rarer forms of cancer, ever rarer forms of genetic conditions, ever rarer forms of this, because that's the place where they can develop something new, right? There's no point in developing another measles vaccine. So it's just that these processes are so expensive now that there's this thing created that 10 years ago didn't exist. If you came in with the condition, they would go, we can't help you. But now we can. The only problem is it costs 40 grand a year to to create this treatment, and that's what I think causes the problem with the pharmacare, right? Is these super expensive designer things are really like straining everybody's budget and figuring out, should we have this available? Should we not have it available? Is it partial? And that's a question that every government and every health plan is going to have to figure out, right?
Yeah, and that's going to exist even without pharmacare. Like the insurance companies need to deal with that too. Like it's just rough. Like it's rough. But I do think that we can apportion more research budgets in like universities and stuff to work on researching these things too, like on bringing the price down. But yeah, it's not easy, and it's a rough ethical argument too. Like, I want to see everyone treated for everything they've got, but is that affordable? Is that reasonable? It's hard to say.
No, it's not an easy question, because if you pretend that you're not extracting the value from someone else, right? Like someone else out there, someone's cutting down their trees and changing it into boards, right? And that person's buying those boards this has got nothing to do with anybody, right? It's just like a person buying something from somebody else, and the government comes in and says, no, we're going to tax this at X%. So you're extracting value from someone who's involved in like a free exchange. And then the problem is, now that you've extracted that value from that person, it's like it's not entirely clear. Like, you can't take that person and impoverish them.
No, and I don't think anyone wants to do that. Yeah.
No, but I think a lot of people are imagining that the value is created for free. I mean, I do think there's like a millennial class of person that's almost like, well, the product of productivity has been solved, right? Like, you know what I mean? These goods and services just sort of spring out of the ground, and it's an apportioning problem, right? And you can't make them go, there's a listen, there's a reason why we don't have affordable homes for everyone, great places for everybody to live. It's not that people are bastards. It's that there's a whole bunch of economic problems, or systems in the way that are putting that are making that costly, right? And so and having someone, it gets more ethically difficult if someone's hurt, and therefore you don't really expect them anymore to produce the same economic value to trade off what you're spending on them, right? Nobody thinks somebody going through cancer treatment is, really rough cancer treatment is working a full-time job. Like, that's not a reasonable expectation, right? So then it gets more ethically rough, and then you're going to have a greater ethnically roughness when people are financing off robots, right? Because the technology has a big chain of people who led to the value creation of this robot, and then once you've got the robot, someone's got to take care of it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's exciting. So on the affordability, mentions housing. You mentioned medication. What about the Canadian housing affordability problem, which is obvious in Burlington, if not other people, and it's now obvious in Grimsby too. You're like, you could live in Grimsby. I'm like, I don't think you've checked prices in Grimsby in 2 years, because the low house cost in Grimsby and Stony Creek and all the way to St. Catharines is like flown away like a little bird. And so how would you address, or at least get your hands around, the affordable housing?
We need to work to build not just luxury units is part of the problem, because the big money for developers is in developing the really high-end units, right? In the high-end spots.
You're talking apartment buildings here, right?
Like apartment buildings, condo buildings, like the big high-rises, that sort of thing. And I think we need, I don't know how to do it. I'm not a housing person, but I think there is a way to properly incentivize the developers to build the right buildings, like to build the right affordable units, like smaller units, perhaps, that sort of thing. Like, you could take the same space and build more affordable stuff out of it. There's just no incentive to do it right now. Like, we've got external foreign developers buying up properties because they know they'll be able to sell them again in 2 years, right? There are people who are just speculating on housing. Like, they are just being bastards. Like, not everyone, but there are people who are doing this because they know that prices are rising. They will make their money back, and way more. Like, they're good investments right now, and like they're extracting value from the people who buy it later without actually doing anything productive to earn it. And there needs to be a way to tax those people, or to disincentivize them from doing that, and more incentivize them to making sure people are able to live in those places now.
The thing is, I've been super deep into this housing mess for 10 years now, right? And the points that have just come to my attention on this is, number one, when you try and build these condo buildings out of rebar and concrete, right? You end up with unfinished space, like finished or low grade space finished in the realm of $600 to $650 per square foot, right? Like, the concrete rebar building is insanely expensive, right? And then if you tried to do the cheapest as townhouses, just weirdly, so the cheapest is townhousing. If you take the land away, those finish out at about 150 to $200 per square foot. So to me, the trap is always people, because the land, you made the land insanely expensive, right? So the apartment building takes this one piece of land that you paid whatever million, $2 million, $10 million for, and then duplicates it, 60 floors high, right? But the building itself is insanely expensive, so it offsets the value of the land, right? So what's creepily happening is, and I think this is the thing that nobody really wants to accept, is the first wave of Burlington people who came in with the land expansion, right? They got these houses. They just had to pay for them at $600, $150 per square foot, $200 per square foot, right? The people that are mushed into these condos, the style of building is insanely more expensive, right? Okay. And they have to eat that dollar per square foot just to make the building. And everyone keeps saying, well, why do the houses keep getting more expensive? And I keep saying, stop making buildings that cost $600 a square foot, because you could just very easily go, well, if it costs $600 a square foot to build this building, and I'm looking for, 1,000 square foot family apartment, which is not, it's a small family apartment. It's 1,500 would be better, but let's just say 1,000, right? Sure. Well, you multiply 600, this thing's 600,000. You multiply the average person makes, and you're like, this doesn't work. So you can see that housing still is expensive, still is cheap where they let you make these things. And we're saying, no, we're not going to let you make these things. We're going to put this urban boundary and compress everyone in for environmental reasons, and your energy cheaper building costs a lot of money up front. And I think that's the problem. As long as you're expanding, as long as you're using immigration to expand the population at a super high rate, and you're not keeping up with expansion, basically at that rate, supply and demand takes over. And then with COVID, obviously single detached houses are a lot more attractive to live in. Not out here so much because we didn't have as tough restrictions, but in Toronto, they had like restrictions for, I don't even know how many months. It was, it went from, oh, you can't do it for this reason, you can't do it to this or that, can't do it to this reason. So I think the affordable housing problem comes into, you decrease the rate of immigration. You don't want to cut it off because that's insane, but you either decrease the rate of immigration, right? Or you break new land to allow people to build houses. And I think in between there, people come up with a lot of stuff that's not likely, in my mind, to work. But maybe it can be engineered. I just don't know how to make it work.
What you're saying is very fair.
So the next part is economy, part of your platform, and say we'll deliver the results we want, much greater equity, and a path to new clean jobs of the future we need. So how would the federal government actually go about making that happen? The clean jobs and the path to the future.
The way to bring in the equity part is certainly to remove some of the tax cuts that have come in recent years. Our platform isn't even to go like super high on taxes on corporations and rich people. We only want to return corporate taxes to what they were in 2010, I believe, is the year. And corporations were still doing just fine in 2010, right? So I think using that money to spread out more on social programs is a way of increasing equity, and it isn't going to be such a big burden on the people that are taxed higher. Like, I think there is room to raise taxes on, like, back, not to extreme levels, but just back 10 years, 20 years ago to those levels, and they'll still be doing fine.
The other part was they had clean jobs of the future that we need.
I assume that would be through... Actually, I don't know what the party has planned for that. That's not in my wheelhouse at all.
You don't have to answer every question. There's a whole party. It's not like, well, I do. I mean, I say when I go these things, I'm like, you're not expected to know every single one of these things, because realistically, the parties have ministers and they pick people, with more expertise in the area to prevent you from having to.
Yeah, like we have 115 pages of commitments, right? So.
Yeah, you guys have a big policy document. Yeah, you have a big policy document. Most people do. So that's why I just go over the summary points, because you can barely get through 6 points in the thing. And then I'll do a little bit, I'll let you react to some liver points. And then your third point on the list is a climate action.
The world has problems, and we're going to have problems if we don't change something. But I think a lot of what people talk about, like personal changes, are good and all, but they're not going to be good enough. I think we need a way for our government to work with the governments of the bigger countries, the ones that are doing even more polluting than we are. Like we need to deal with our own pollution too. We can't be buying pipelines. We need to be finding ways to switch away from gas into the more renewable forms. Wind, solar, nuclear, those sort of things. We need to invest in those, but we need to also work with getting other countries to make that switch too.
Well, you get this is this goes back to previous conversation, but you do have this bad actor problem, right? Where if you have this this huge pile of pollution and it's everyone's problem. Well, if 80% of the world decides to take a huge economic hit to clean this problem up, and you're the last country, and you're just like, great, 80% of the pollution went away.
It's the
Now
prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, no, it is the prisoner's dilemma. Is how do you stop the bad actor, right? And I do think there's a change here because you pointed out that the other countries are much more, they're much more polluting because they have more people, right? That's basically what it comes down to. Per capita, we would blow them away, but since they have less people, since they have so many more people, what they do has a fantastically much larger impact than what we do because we have so few people comparatively, right? So
exactly.
I do think it's interesting. There's an interesting dilemma. Even if you accept the problem is massive and pending, right? You can say, I'm going to retroact it. I'm just going to, for my own moral high ground, do whatever we can to cut it down as fast as possible. Then I think you sort of almost lose negotiation points versus saying, no, we're gonna try to project our power to enforce other people to get on the bandwagon and only act as like a unified structure, right? Because
it's a global problem.
Yeah, but my previous example is if nuclear warheads are your problem, right? The second you don't have nuclear warheads, nobody invites you to a treaty over nuclear warheads.
Yeah.
Right, because you're no longer in the nuclear warhead thing. The only people that can reduce the number of Soviet and Chinese ballistic missiles reasonably is the United States, because they're the only people that can say, I'm going to decrease my stockpile by 20% if you guys decrease your stockpile by 20%, and then everybody goes, well, this makes sense, right? If the states just by themselves says we're throwing away all the nuclear missiles, that doesn't stop China and Russia from being in the same game and keeping 1,000 of them, right? So you would prefer a more internationalist approach and less of a unilateral, hey, we're going to make these changes.
Yeah, I think it is important to do research, because as we bring the cost of renewables down, it becomes more likely we can get other people to use them. But yeah, the world needs everyone to work together on it, and it's not something we can solve on our own. We do need to take some steps, but we can't, like you're saying, we can't just, if we stop polluting entirely, the world's still going to keep heating, right? So we need to find a way to get everyone working on it.
Right. And then you can't, because of your position in Canada, you can sort of use your credits to say, hey, we're going to do this much reduction. We're going to offer this up if you do this, right? And the technology transfer is interesting, right? Because you have a whole series of, they're called third world countries. It occurred to me what a terrible term that is to use on countries, like the third world, like a different world of countries. But anyway, they obviously cannot pull themselves out of this, right? Like they're so trapped down the technology tree and the expertise tree. That's hard to believe that without some kind of external subsidy or push, they're going to unilaterally say, hey, we're not going to burn gasoline in barrels. We're going to go to these, solar powered heaters. So I'm happy to see that you acknowledge it's a global problem, because I do feel that some politicians are just like, no, we just unilaterally do X, Y, Z. But we don't really have to consider what everyone's doing. Once we do it, our moral superiority will make them feel bad, effectively. and they'll decide not to do it. So climate action, there's a strengthening healthcare is the NDP's fourth element. Make sure everyone's covered. You covered that partially, but I assume you're going to say the same thing for hospital care, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And then everyone's got reconciliation. So there's reconciliation with the Indigenous communities is your guys' next point.
So I personally haven't followed this very much. I think we do have a huge problem that we need to deal with, because the issues aren't just in the past. Like, some people like to think, oh, some of the stuff is just in the past. We're better now, but we're not better now. Like last year, in Nova Scotia, the RCMP went after Indigenous people who were fishing lobsters, like within their treaty rights, and the RCMP went after them. They shut them down. They, the fishers in Nova Scotia ruined their catches. It's still going on. We do need to find a way to deal with it, but I'm not the person to do it, unfortunately. I think the NDP party is in a better spot than the Liberals. The Liberals aren't taking the actions they need to do. I hope that we will.
Yeah, listen, I'm not. None of us are going to solve this NDP lobster thing, but it is the problem right on the head, right? In that the government of Canada has a quota system and a fisheries time of the year. If I understand what's going on, if I'm mistaken, that optimize the number of lobsters you create by letting them, I think, have the first part of their life and spawn off or whatever, and then you fish them later, right? And then there's a band of I don't know what the band with the correct worm is, but whatever. There's a group of indigenous out there, sort of led by one guy, that says, no, our traditional fishery time is earlier than what the government of Canada says, and we're going to execute this earlier time. And then the local fishers are like, you can't just go mop up all the lobsters for 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever it is, and then wait to the essential fishing season, which all the lobsters are now trapped out. And so it's an incredibly thorny problem to engage with, because on one hand you have the Canadian government, which has a whole bunch of science and standard European interlocking narratives, right? To be like, well, why should you do this? Why should you wait this amount of time? And the other side, they go, well, this is our traditional right to manage, and this is our this is the way, we are using our own system to sense how many lobsters we should take and not take. The systems are too diametrically opposed. There's no reconciliation because they never were one system on this point, right? And then to make it worse, they say, okay, well, you have the right to have a moderate living fisheries, but you can't run a commercial fishery out of your Indigenous rights. And that's decided by some Supreme Court of Canada. And then the Indigenous go, why did the Supreme Court of Canada gain jurisdiction over this international issue? So there's a mess. There's no way to.
It is a mess.
No way to. Yeah, but I appreciate you very much saying it's a mess, right? To say, okay, well, this is a mess. This is something to deal with. Whereas a lot of people are pretending it's not a mess. They just say, okay, well, this will somehow work out if we're all nice and we all try our best. We can sort of resolve this dispute in a way which everyone is not pissed off. Where I sort of suspect the compromise has to piss everyone off.
Yeah, a little, piss everyone off a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it has to piss everyone off a little bit, and that's the problem with all these compromises. Is everybody feels they're ripped off at the end, but they have to trade for some peaceful solution. So we're almost through the NDP. They got strong communities, a vision where communities can afford to build the infrastructure they need to thrive, from roads, bridges, community centers, long-term care, childcare centers, and everything in between. Actually, you can talk about the childcare component, because the feds have the Liberals have a very strong subsidized childcare push.
Childcare is really important, and but like everything else is also tricky. We need to find a way to make it affordable and to have slots exist. Like in a lot of places, it's not even a matter of price. There aren't enough slots in early childcare centers. Like a couple of years ago, my friends that I lived with, their kids couldn't. They had to stay in the program part time, or they'd be kicked out, and they wouldn't be able to get into any program because there would be no room left for them. And I think that's what's driving up the prices. We need to find a way to ensure there's enough supply. If that is subsidizing the training or the pay of these people, we need to find a way to properly incentivize there to be enough early child care. I'm not sure what the right word is, educators or like daycare workers or whatever it is. We need to make sure that there's the incentive for enough people to do that work so that there's enough slots for all the kids, and then we can work on bringing the price down. Because right now it's the restriction of supply, I think, that's really driving the prices up and making it unaffordable.
It's definitely true, like Toronto. But that's like, so, but the other mix in there, just because I know, because I have small kids, right, is that Halton Region does have subsidized daycare, right? So if you put your hand up and you say, I can't afford daycare, they'll subsidize it down to like $8 a day for you, right? The downside to that is that the local region that's implementing this has a lot of like, you have to accept this, you have to accept this. Like, there's a lot of restrictions on how many kids you have to accept from the stream of subsidized kids, right? Because you have a stream of unsubsidized kids and now a stream of subsidized kids. And so the daycare is not stupid, right? If the amount of money you can get from the community is over the subsidy level, right? Then they'll obviously just take those kids, and they don't want the subsidy kids. Not because they're bastards, just because they're trying to get as much money as they can, right? And then if it reverses, the reverse happens. So if it goes under, if just what people are willing to pay in the communities under the subsidy level, then they want subsidy kids, because the subsidies is like, whatever it is, $50 a day. The parents pay a different rate based on their income, and then the daycare gets their $54 a day, right? Rather than 70 directly. So it's complicated to wade in. It's complicated to wade into. And there's also a tension, because the more quality you insert in it and say, well, there has to be X outdoor space and has to be an indoor space, then that goes to the cost. The cost of real estate, of commercial real estate, this is one of my bugaboos every time I'm, in dealing with the Burlington government. The cost of real estate is tremendous, right? Like these daycares are on, these pad sites that might be paying 10, 15, 20 G's a month just for these commercial sites, which just have a parking lot, and it's $1 million building, to be fair. I mean, to put those things up, but you're like, this is how much this costs. So there's lots of complexity there, but after COVID there might be a rental crash, and we can see, but that's another sticky wicket. So and then they have doing right, committed to a future where their racism, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia have no place, where we fight for reproductive justice and an end to gender-based violence, and where government treats people with respect and dignity we all deserve. I'll let you talk to it, but I don't think you're going to say I'm opposed to all of that, but go ahead.
That just all sounds like basic human rights that I think we should be working towards making sure is true.
It's slightly straw manning. There's very few people actually actively who would phrase like, I'm actively excited about discrimination. I need to, there's no person who's from that specter just saying, I'm trying to increase the discrimination in the world, right?
A lot of these things are kind of implicit, or just not something you even think about. You don't have to be actively racist in order for you to still perpetuate systemic racism. So I do think it's important that we just center the discussion, and it's important to not make people feel bad about the way our culture is set up, but it is still important that we try to be better day after day after day.
No, I appreciate both those elements. And I was going to ask, just because you mentioned systemic racism, so what's your definition of systemic racism? Because the definitions are all over the place, right? Like when people say that, they mean different things.
So for me, it is when our society or our functions are set up in a way that favors one group over another. So it's the sort of thing where if your family is rich, you're more likely to be better off, right? But families that were rich 100 years ago were by and large white because of just the way their society was structured. So that's the sort of thing that just keeps bubbling forward and forward, and it's the sort of thing that we just need to keep in mind, that this does exist, and that if we can do something to make it better without like screwing everyone else over, I think it's really important that we do that sort of work.
It's very challenging because you run right into this thing where if you, so the one thing that'll also trigger me on the NDP is there your platform had this thing and it said, well, new immigrants to the country make X% of people who live here natively, right? And therefore we can see that they're being discriminated against. And I was kind of like, well, hold on a second, maybe, but you have to assume that there's a whole bunch of language, culture, how to get things done impediments that would take a little bit of time to work out, I would think.
Yeah.
If you said someone who's been, an immigrant to Canada 30 years later or 40 years later is a doctor and they're making less than a Canadian born doctor, I'd sort of put my hand up and go, well, hold on, there's something to be investigated there. But it quizzed my time is like, how long what does a person think is a reasonable time frame to adapt to all these things? Like, I don't think if you took me and you plunked me down in a random country, right, I wouldn't have just a massive learning curve in figuring out, how to say hello, how do you run a business? Like, just there would be this huge learning curve. I wouldn't think I could get the same job because, like, I can't sell someone a television. Just as an example, right? My even if I'm good with the language, I'm not fluent. I don't know, the ways around. So it creates an interesting, like, you can design a society in which, like, you could just give everybody the same amount of money the minute they got off the plane, right? But I'm not entirely sure we should be expect to be so noble that we instantly accelerate everybody up to the same level. That's possible to do, or we should be expected to do it. Mm-hmm. I only note that because that was a point in the Ndp platform. They sort of said it's taking too long for immigrants to sort of get the same standard of living. I didn't say acclimate. It was like, oh, they don't have the same standard of living, right? And as quickly as we might like was the implication. I can't remember the exact line. I think I wrote it down somewhere. And I was like, well, you would have to expect that. Like, we have a whole Canadian education system, which is presumably producing value for people who are going to live in Canada, right? And presumably it's executing at a higher level. Hence, it's a G8 country, right? And so if you come from a non-G8 country, I don't think the education system there is good. Like, I would expect it not to be.
Good.
Yeah, on average. I mean, obviously there's kids in private schools that are, bawling in every country, if the parents or whatever. So that's another interesting question is, if people emigrate and English isn't their first language, I don't think they're going to do as well in the short term as people who speak English, right? Like, I would not expect them to.
If they went to Quebec.
Or French, yeah, exactly. And so I don't know that's a fair attack on Canadian society that we can't. There's a lag, There's traditionally a generational lag. It used to take 50 years to get your bearings and have kids, and then the kids figure out the lay of the land. But I also appreciate you saying that you have to be careful about denigrating the current culture completely.
Yeah, it's tricky, but yeah. We also don't want everyone to be the same, right? So.
No, I don't want everyone to be the same, but I have I have sort of a spidey sense that most people, like, you have a bunch of people living in the country, most people are going to buy in through their Canadian identity, right? They have this Canadian identity. And if you keep degrading the Canadian identity and saying, well, this culture's got this beautiful thing, this culture is this beautiful thing, this culture is this beautiful thing. Oh, Canada's got nothing to go for it because of this injustice and this injustice, which, in all fairness, the Canadian government has their role in. I'm not suggesting it's not real, right? And people say, well, I'm not going to see myself as Canadian anymore because I don't want to be associated with this. What else are they going to pick? that binds the population together, and in a way that goes forward. All right. So I think that the basic summary, if I've got your vibe down, is your impression is there's a series of things that need to be done on the climate issue, on this income issue, that prepares for the reality of the future, and it's just not being done.
That's where I'm coming from. I want to see us be ready for the future. Yeah. And I don't think the Liberals are getting us there.
Well, they have a very specific sort of vision. Like I read through this article, and it basically, there's like 34 guys, and they have this vision that by 2100, the Canadian population's up to like 100 million, right? And this provides this buffer provides this buffer against this kind of like, the Canadians have the land and they have the resources, and I don't know, prevents some sort of imaginary stampede. I'm not quite sure what's exactly imagined there in the face of climate change and disruptions. It's kind of like a terrible vision of the world, because it starts off with like, well, there'll be all these disruptions of these massive flow of migrants, and we better get into a position to say, well, we have 2,100 people, we did what we could, or not 2,100, but we have 100 million people, we did what we could, instead of sitting here saying, no, we're still doing okay with our 21 million people on 20% of the world's fresh water. Still working out for us. And that's kind of the idea. But it starts with this dystopian vision, and I'm not really sure it gets to a better place. But so what's wrong? So other than degree, what's wrong with the focus on the Liberals? So, I mean, just one of the things that they are sort of proud of on their platform is protecting people from COVID-19. And that goes to borders. The feds on that are the borders, and then the income subsidies through the whole COVID timeframe.
The borders I liked. Like I liked the fact that we tried to restrict people from coming in with COVID. If the Liberals didn't want to do nearly as much as they did with CERB, I believe they wanted $800 a month, and we forced them up to $2,000. The NDP. Yeah, so they did good, but they didn't do enough with what they wanted to do. And if they got a majority, like, they would have just done what they wanted to do. They wouldn't have done the gone up to 2,000, which I think significantly would have hurt people.
I don't think it would be continuing, to tell you the truth. Like, I think what's holding Canada as a society together is that $2,000 a month. So that if the feds did something and closed your business and you got fired or let go, you're like, okay, right, there was this huge restriction, but I have $2,000 a month. I'm getting by.
Yeah, I can try to come out of this when we get out of it. And we're not there yet. Like, the vaccination rates are doing good. They should be better, but they're doing good. But there's still a fourth wave coming. We're in the middle of the Delta variant, so there's still work to be done, and it'd be nice if they were still in government doing that work instead of out campaigning. Yeah,
I gotta tell you, in all fairness, though, I listened to Trudeau. Trudeau just said, well, the when you go to the idea of what's wrong with more democracy, what's wrong with letting people choose who they get out of the pandemic, I'm like, man, that is a tough argument to overtop. It's really tough if he just sits there and sticks to it and says, more democracy is better. We need a mandate to lead Canada out of COVID. It's hard to attack, because before that I was like, man, they're going to get fried on calling an election in the midst of this, right? The numbers are going to go like 500, 1,000, and then by the time the election, you could be up to like Ontario, you could be up to like 1,000, 2,000 a day. Really, like within the realm of reason. This is not spectering mania produced by me. This could really happen, and and people are going to go to the polls and be like, why did you put an election in the middle of this? But I do think this idea of like, well, who do you want us to lead us out of this? We've never had a referendum on the Liberals, on our mandate during the thing. I think that's a tough argument. I think they're just like, okay, well, you win, more democracy. I think it could backfire on them huge, but I do think that's a good argument. So you talked about the helping through measures, and I do take your point. Your point is vote NDP, Because at minimum, in the minority government, we're putting a lot of pressure on the Liberals to get more of what they want. They are having to deal with us.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are working with us on at least some points. So we're getting stuff done. We'd get more done if we were a majority, but we certainly less would get done if the Liberals have a majority. So we prefer to get like we just want to get as many seats as we can so that we can have as much say in what the Liberals do. Because, like I was saying earlier, I think government works better when more people's voices are heard, and that works better when different parties are forced to work together. I think that is a strength.
Yeah, but yeah. Now, when you're a majority, someone's going to like haul this clip up and say, "This is the reason to vote against them. The NDP have a majority. We need more flowers to bloom in government."
Well, if we have a majority, we'll work to change the electoral system so that we don't just have all the power. So I personally do think that's dangerous.
So your big complaint is degree, not direction, right? It's the degree of commitment to these things, not really the direction.
On a lot of issues, yeah, the Liberals, it's that the Liberals don't go far enough, or that they say the right things and then don't actually do them.
Right.
Like, they promised electoral reform, they didn't do it. Now they're promising, like, some of their promises are things that we were in the process of passing, and they just didn't get done, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a standard political trick, right? You want to cut you they got to run around, they got to say something. They're in power, right? So they're MPs. When you're in power, your MPs get a lot of exposure. This is your problem, right? They get a lot of exposure on the news, et cetera, right? They're very refined in like what they're saying in this message. So they want to create attention that makes people think to themselves, "Oh, I'm going to lose this," or "If I don't go vote for this person," rather than just be like apathetic and be like, "What does it really matter?" Right? So that's a standard process. So you're into most of these things, and then so what? So the Green Party has some similar things in this spectrum. Why are you guys in the right place of the spectrum if you want to make it a spectrum?
Personally, I preferred the NDP to the Greens because of the commitment to the ordinary, like the labor, and not so much corporations. Is like, I do think the Green Party is right on a lot of things. Part of why I want to see a better electoral system is that more people can vote, who go along with the Green beliefs can vote Green. But yeah, right now the NDP in a two-party in first past the post, the NDP are better positioned right now, like just from historical reasons, and that means that we're the better option for right now, even like despite whatever the platform differences might be, just the reality of first past the post, which is why I think first past the post is such a problem, in that you have to make these strategic calls instead of voting necessarily for who you most would support, like off their platform.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, you're absolutely right about the fact that you have to sit there and you have to say, if these two parties are close and my seat flips, right? Where I might one of these other parties, I don't want to vote for an NDP. Like, in my preference of who I want, I would just, this hypothetical voter would say, well, I'd like maybe the NDP first, and then maybe the Liberals, and maybe the Conservatives last. But if it looks like it's going to be a jump ball, I got to vote Liberal to prevent my vote from splitting. Right? You have the vote split. That's a problem. That's definitely the negative with the first past the post. The only thing is, I do have 2 points where I kind of like first past the post. The first one is it produces when the electoral system executes. If there's any disputes, the disputes are only in small areas, right? Because we never have to adjudicate the vote Canada wide. Most of it's a blowout, and people go, well, even if it's 5% fraud, who cares? Right? We're not even going to look into it, right? Because those all cog one way or another. And there's then a couple ridings we're arguing on, right? Whereas I think I worry if you had it, the vote distributed, and then people were arguing over if it was really close, and people were arguing about who forms the government based on a half of 1%. It could create a dispute in like single every single jurisdiction over what went on in the ballots. You see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but like that kind of leads into what's going on in the US where there's all these allegations of voter fraud, but there weren't any. Like they haven't been able to show any fraud at all in any place. Like it's one of those things that people bring up as a concern that just doesn't happen. Like 5% fraud is just that is not something that happens in our system, or even close to it.
No, I don't think it is. I'm just saying that you prevents you. In the states would be the example, right? The states localized the disputes to a couple states, right? Most of the states were just like, well, whatever, it doesn't matter because California wins this seat, electoral college seat. I really do think the electoral college has a very, 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 very interesting and noteworthy ability to shove attentions into less populated less populated areas of the United States. Like it really does force these candidates into all of these states that they would normally have nothing to do with, and then you have these like primaries. There's some genius to it. I do think to myself, with all the Donald Trump, with all these things, they've sort of survived all these things, intact, and still force people's attention rather than going, well, hold on a second. If it's vote for vote, I can do so much better just hanging around the cities, right? That's the other problem, is that if you do it directly, why would these people ever leave Toronto or Vancouver where they can, snap their fingers and get a 10,000 person rally after a 10,000 person rally after a 10,000 person rally? You see what I mean? Since the population's there and I'm going to get rewarded in ratio of my population, there's no point for me ever to leave. So I do think there has to be some kind of, I don't know, something that makes you go, oh no, I got to go to Nova Scotia and I got to go to these things and I got to show up to a Nova Scotia coffee shop, and like, that's what they'll do. You know what I mean? They have to go out there and go to a coffee shop, and Justin Trudeau has to sit there and talk to a couple hundred people. And then, when he gets to Toronto, it's like a 10,000 people, whatever, huge rally, right? Or bigger rally, I shouldn't say huge. Canadian politics doesn't have the same, mass U.S. appeal. But with the Donald Trump thing, I do think the Electoral College and the first past the post really did help, actually, because it made the problem a couple states, and then we could all argue about these states rather than them arguing about 56 states, because it was close, and then we were arguing in each jurisdiction. Anyway, it's interesting. I'm not opposed to it, but it's an interesting question. So I think you've highlighted very well. This will be easy. You can end the interview with easy questions. So what don't you like about the conservative platform, which is basically, it's the secure notion: secure jobs, secure accountability, secure mental health, secure the country, secure the economy. And then they do have in the environment a couple low carbon savings ideas. What's the problem with that? Why would...
Well, that doesn't even mean anything. What do they even mean when they say they're going to secure the economy? Like, I don't.
They mean the spending. They mean the spending's out of control and potentially dangerous, potentially ruinous, and they would not be willing to borrow tremendous amounts of money to buck up this time through COVID. They wouldn't. They would say this is what we can do, and maybe we just got to close the file and leave people to their own devices. The economy's open. Do what you want. Wear a mask. Don't. We're done. We did what we could. File closed. And escape basically the current structure, right?
Well, I just think that is, personally, I believe that as a society we have a responsibility to everyone, and that plan is throw everyone to the wolves and see who survives, and that I don't like that at all. Like, it's just kind of diametrically opposed to where I stand.
See, they're going to say, just to play out devil's advocate, you're throwing the next generation to the wolves. That's the reverse. You're so worried about people currently. I mean, the Fed's debt service interest is 10% now. It's like $16 billion right? So 16 billion is the whole active military. They're like the number of things that are 16 billion are on that list of what the feds are spending is quite huge, right?
Mhm.
That's what they're going to say. They're going to say you're endangering the core of Canada to try and do too much. If I want to channel their argument.
Yeah, but we have a plan to just raise revenue to deal with that. We don't want to cut the spending because I think the spending is really important, but our plan is to raise the revenue with returning tax rates, rolling them back 10 or 20 years.
That would be the differential. But in all fairness, they would accept that. Like if you said to the like, just not channel all the whole Conservative Party, right? But if they're true conservatives and you said to them, you said there's, you're a minority government hypothetically, right? And there's two forks in the road. You could say we're going to create this level of spending and not tax it, or we're going to have this level of spending, but we're going to tax it right now. We're going to pay our way. We're not going to live in fantasy mode. This causes a lot of pain, and we're going to take our pain now. They would say, "Oh, that's better." It's not their choice, but it's better on the spectrum, right? And that's like the secure. It's interesting because the word secure pre implies two things. The thing is a value, right? And it's working well. You don't secure things of no value, or that aren't working well. So that implies the whole Canadian construction is doing well, and it's a proper conservative notion. It's not discordant with the party or the idea, right? The one idea, and then under environment, I'll just run by that I did think they were interesting because it's kind of a conservative notion how to deal with some of the carbon, is low carbon savings account. And then this is a specific idea. The way it would work is you go to the pump and you fill your car up, right? They tax 10% of whatever, I don't know what the percentage is, but let's just say it's 10. They're going to tax you 10%, but that money is going to be diverted into a savings account, and that savings account can only be used for green purchases. So all you could do with it is like buy a electric car, or maybe some kind of new high efficiency furnace and things like that.
That doesn't sound super unreasonable. I think all of the, like I wouldn't put all of it there, but that sounds reasonable. Like I think for me, a lot of it is finding incentives to get people to do what you want them to do, and that is an incentive to get people to do what we want them to do, to have a more efficient furnace, to have to install solar panels on the roof of their house, or have an electric car, that sort of thing. Those things are better, and finding a way to incentivize people to take those actions is good. So, yeah, that doesn't sound unreasonable to me.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good actually. I don't understand why we can't get this done. It seems like I almost guarantee every person I talk to is going to say like, well, that's not unreasonable. They're not going to have, they're going to say maybe it's not far enough, right? But if you propose this thing, I don't understand why this hadn't gotten done. It seems almost, you could make an argument, well, it's going to push up pricing. It's going to be hard with it. You could make, that would be your argument. Well, it's going to push up pricing and go through. But since the Conservatives would be the most conservative party, theoretically the most attached to that idea and promoting it, seems to me that's something that should get done. So is there anything else you'd like to add to get across what you're about, what your party's about, why this is an important decision?
No, I think we've covered a lot. I'm good with where we are.
Well, I'm telling you, you're going to be happy with the long form podcast going forward, right? Because what happens, did you run in the last election or?
Oh no, this is the first time I've run in anything.
Yeah, my personal experience is what happens is in about 2 weeks, every media organization will want like 15 minutes of your time, right? And then you'll talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and they'll try and crush 2 sound bites out of that conversation, right? Because they all want to write this article. Oh, who should you vote for? And it's going to be like Nick Page for UBI. And it'll have nothing. You won't have managed to put in the fact that you've thought about it, or you realize to have taxpayers. And then like somebody will say something and you'll be like, well, that's not what I said at all, which is why I wanted to get the long form podcast out there, so that there's some frame of reference that people could go to and refer to your thoughts on the matter at length, and get a sense of who you are and how you react to the opposite arguments of these things. So what's next? What's next, Nick?
What's next is we are going to be putting out videos where I dig into specific policies more. Like I'm going to try to do deep dives on some of our commitments to release over the course of the campaign. We're going to do as much campaigning and canvassing as we can do safely in the pandemic. And then we're going to see what happens.
Well, I appreciate very much your time. Hopefully people who listen got a good sense of who you are and why they should vote for you. And thanks very much, Nick.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
No troubles. Good luck.